I'm Molly Wright Steenson, and I wear several hats at Carnegie Mellon. I am an associate professor in the School of Design. I am the K&L Gates Associate Professor of Ethics and Computational Technologies, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Research for the College of Fine Arts.
Can you tell me a little bit about how your work in regards to AI began?
Sure. It began with a footnote. I am an architectural historian, at least that's what my PhD is in, and when I was working on my dissertation, I was doing research on the architect Christopher Alexander, who has had a large influence on computer scientists. And I was reading his book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, and taking a look at the footnotes, because the footnotes are fantastic in this particular book. And I should mention that around the time I was working on the dissertation in the mid-2000s, there was a lot of work going on about architecture and the history of cybernetics, but there wasn't so much history going on about AI. In fact, nobody was looking at AI and architecture, and I found a footnote where Christopher Alexander had referred to Marvin Minsky's paper, Steps Toward Artificial Intelligence. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Here is this 1964 book and a 1960 or so reference. I wonder where that leads, and that leads me to me sitting here talking to you today. So that footnote led me to examining the role of models of intelligence in the field of architecture. And a lot of the architecture that I was looking at that was designed in the 60s had more to do with processes of design than buildings themselves, more a question of what could our interfaces be to the world versus what does an actual physical building look like. So using that as a starting point, architects in the 60s and 70s were interested in how to break open the field of architecture and open it up in new kinds of ways. And so studies of cybernetics and of artificial intelligence and of imagining buildings as responsive and intelligent structures that could anticipate what the inhabitants of a building were doing or challenge them or things like that were really interesting at that time, and an interesting provocation to more mainstream practices of architecture. So my dissertation, which became my book, which is titled Architectural Intelligence: How Designers and Architects Created the Digital Landscape, it came out on MIT Press in 2017, looked at that history in the work of a couple of architects, Christopher Alexander, Cedric Price. He's a British architect that people tend not to know very much about in this country, but was well known in England. And Nicholas Negroponte, who is the founder of the MIT Media Lab, who many people don't think of as an architect. And so in that work, I traced a number of things, including generative structures and generative architecture in buildings that would challenge their users, to the history and practice of defense funding and how it structured the MIT Media Lab in its previous incarnation. Before the MIT Media Lab was the Media Lab, it was something called the Architecture Machine Group. Negroponte founded it with his colleague Leon Greusser in 1967. And it was in existence to 1984 when it became a part of the Media Lab. It also used the same defense funding that the AI Lab did and the Department of Electrical Engineering. So the same, I guess, trends and requirements of the defense industry upon MIT at that time also structured the predecessor to the Media Lab. And so that's something that I've traced as well. So that's part of my work, but I'm also interested in the contemporary implications of AI on design and the built environment and how we live in the world. It probably wouldn't surprise you that I think of architecture as something a lot bigger than just the buildings that we move around in, but rather that it's a process or an interface to the world, just as software is an interface to the world. And so one of the things that I'm very interested in is how how we experience those crossovers today. I don't know if I'd use the term science fiction, although it's something that I cross over into, but I might look at imaginaries, and I might look at some of the practices we use in design, things like speculative fiction or critical design, where the goal is to kind of design the artifacts of a certain kind of situation or future. And those artifacts can kind of bring to bear the world that you're envisioning, if you can think about that. I find a lot of that work in history. So if I were to look behind you at the books on the shelves behind you, I might be pulling out things from the 60s and 70s as ways that we've always done this. I might also draw out books from the turn of the century or even earlier, turn of the 20th century, to look at different ways that we've always kind of looked at those questions. But as I see it, my work in history is a kind of science fiction. I look back in order to look ahead, and I see history as a bunch of potential futures that may or may not have happened that way or may not have been interpreted in that way. And they still have valence today. One thing that I look at is the use of cliches. I've been collecting them for a while, and I know that this is something that people like Anna Lauren Hoffman at University of Washington has written about in a more scholarly manner, but I've been collecting them for a couple of years. AI is the new oil. AI, or what is it? Yeah, AI is the new oil. AI is the new user interface. Big data is the new oil. There's an AI named Molly that is the new everything. And I'm always struck by the fact that we keep talking about AI as though it's new. It isn't new. We've been using the term since 1955. We've been using the concept probably since, I don't know, you could say 1936 or 1948 or 1 AD if you want to follow Pamela McCorduck's phrasing of it. It's something that we've been using for a while. So the question is, why cliches? Why do we keep coming back to them? I think it's important that we rescue AI from just becoming cliche. I think that Ruman Chowdhury has said that AI is just a synonym for software. I think it might be a synonym for computation. It's far fewer syllables, easier to spell. You can just say it's got AI in it, and it's sort of like Intel Inside or spandex. You know, these jeans are stretchy because they've got AI or spandex or, I don't know, NutraSweet or whatever it might be. But I think that we're holding on to it because we're always trying to understand and express something about the power of computation, something that might be beyond our ken and beyond our reach. And that's why we come back to these cliches. One thing that a student of mine, a student named Jae-Yoon Ha, J-Ha, H-U-H, has done is collecting the color palettes of different AI posters and movie posters, and he finds that they're typically these shades of kind of aqua and icy blue. You can totally picture them now that I've said it. Maybe a little red for accenting, right? You know, sort of like Dave in, or I'm sorry, like HAL 9000. And I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that in 2001. But Jay points out that these colors are cold and make him feel alone. And if he was going to counter these versions of AI, maybe what he'd want to do is make something warmer or safer or something that covers its eyes so it doesn't get overwhelmed. And I thought that that was an interesting approach to fighting back against the cliches. I think we need cliches and metaphors because we don't have other ways to talk about things. We know this from the world of literature, of course. The question is, I guess, not obfuscating the meaning of the technology or the possibilities or dumbing it down. I wonder if there's a way to use it for good, so to speak.
Are there any examples that come to mind that have been successful or that seem to be offering the semblance of a model towards that, or has it most of what you've come in contact really fallen into these categories, whether visual
I roll my eyes a lot.
That's fine.
I really do. There was an ad agency in the UK that tried to rebrand different machine learning or AI-related technologies with different kinds of visualizations, still and moving images to sort of, I guess, evoke what the technologies do. But it's more a response. It doesn't really explain. I recently downloaded an astrology app, and it said that it was going to use its AI to use some NASA data to figure out my charts. And I'm thinking, this is awesome. That's great. A floppy disk could do this in 1994. What's different, right? Again, I think that it just comes to mean that which is ever so slightly out of reach or magical, and that which I'm not meant to understand. Stars be damned. It's interesting because a lot of my speaking and my writing is, ranging from historical to academic for art or architectural audiences to academic for computer science, HCI, and communications audiences, to general publics. And in fact, increasingly, I'm doing more and more work to a general public, and I'm interested in that mode of translation. So one thing that I see that I'm doing is translating. Another that I'm doing is harvesting. One of the things that I, again, talk about in almost every talk I give some way or another is that AI isn't the new anything because AI isn't new. We set up the framework for how we research this in 1956. Isn't it dangerous if we keep saying it's new? What could be lost if we keep saying this is new? What we lose is the ability to critique, to draw from the past, and what we gain is the ever-shortening cycle of markets and monetization. And I guess I've been in academia for too long, even at a place with the technology that CMU has. I just am a little bit too critical about that. So I want to ask questions, and I want to get people to playfully engage with some of these questions. I'd like folks to see that it isn't out of their reach to ask questions. As a design professor, one thing, one thing I'm trying to do is make it so students understand that there is a place for them to work in this field. It's important to realize that when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about data and data collection. We're talking about models for understanding and parsing that data. And so roles that designers play aren't just making things attractive to someone on the end or making something look pretty, but rather design researchers might set up protocols for how we collect data. They might be doing qualitative research around the role of data in our lives. They might be working against unintended bias because they might be able to flag questions, flag problems before they come up. They might be able to do things that would support the protection of people's privacy. And also I think it's worth noting that even at companies like Facebook, work around fairness in AI is falling in a design capacity under people or under the product design organization. So say what you will about Facebook, they're at least placing it where people are interacting with it in the end, right? And we'll see how successful they are, but I actually appreciate the fact that that's where it resides. So I want to educate design students and architecture students to think about it in those capacities. As I see it, design is where the rubber meets the road. And so these questions are absolutely questions of design. This is a reason that it is important to think of how something is designed when you have a team of people working on something that is enabled by advanced computation. And perhaps perhaps they're actual designers or design researchers on those teams, or perhaps people on those teams have the ability to think of the ways in which something is designed and how its impact and its potential impacts for end users. So you can do that with humans or you can do that with skills, but both of those things are necessary to consider. And we know many, many situations where that hasn't been the case, or where I think market pressures can make some of those concerns fall out of the equation, often to bad effect. Well, I mean, obviously the big shifts today in artificial intelligence are the fact that we have basically unlimited data storage, very, very fast processing power. We are networked in a way that we never were networked in 1956 or 1964, right? And computation at scale is a part of people's daily lives in a way it never was before. So I think there are possible modes of engagement with collective intelligence that we see in a variety of different capacities. It's not really my area of research, but it's still a pretty clear and obvious effect, what happens at scale when everybody is somehow connected. I've long studied the impact of mobile telephony in India, for instance. Spent some time there in 2006 or so, before the smartphone, looking at how people shared mobile phones, and learning that everybody shares under certain circumstances, and even then you see things at scale. So obviously scale is bigger than ever, but I think another thing I'd say, you asked about architecture and the question of scale. We look a lot at AI at scale in cities through the question of smart cities. I have some questions about smart cities sometimes, because I think from a technology company standpoint, it's an ability to make a massive sale of enterprise computing at a larger and larger and larger level. Whether it's a smart grid or it's a smart set of sensors or whatever, and we see the moves toward these. We see these moves toward smart cities, and then we see the ways that they don't quite succeed. I still think the fact that we all carry computers in our pockets and purses is pretty extraordinary, and the iPhones and Androids and other smart devices we carry are already organizing and reshaping our cities in some very simple ways. We follow different map paths that are easier to get through because our Waze app tells us to, which might develop or hinder the development of certain neighborhoods, might bring cars through that don't usually come through, we see this happening in Polish Hill here. Yes, cars go too fast. Yep. Slow down. Yes. We didn't want you to come through here. Mm-hmm. So we see this again in technological, in ways that we think of technological, and ways we don't. But I also think it's, like I said, it's important to look at the questions behind why smart cities, and what's at stake. I am sometimes not totally convinced about what the players have in mind. This is what I've been working on my syllabi today. I'm finding a couple of articles. One article that I referred to in one syllabus points out, it's like the movie Soylent Green. It's people! It's people all the way down. And anytime you say AI or say technology, actually what you mean is humans and the work product of humans. I'm proud to say that I'm teaching Karl Marx this semester in my seminar, as well as Lily Irani's work on Mechanical Turk. And I'm going to be bringing this into my class in Qatar next week as we look at the role of humans in AI. This is a class called AI in Society. And you can look at the questions of AI for good, AI for change, but if you're not looking at the disenfranchisement of people or the shifting in roles of people, then I think you've got a problem. And I also find myself going back to history and the history of architecture and computation. In the 1960s, architects knew that there would be more and more people whose lives would be changed by technology, and started developing architectural projects that would address these new futures in which people had more leisure time. But interestingly, they phrased it in terms of leisure and playful retraining. And learning opportunities that might be provided through buildings that would be almost like, if you could imagine, a contemporary cyber cafe.
Yeah, and Marx would be making reference to this in the rise of industrialization in the 19th century.
And the Satanic Mills also, but that's like a little bit, yeah, a little bit different there. But I think there's, if I can put somewhat of a positive spin on it and drawing from history, I think there's something that we might learn in possibilities for playfulness, and we might remember that we have been asking these questions since the 19th century, since the 20th century, and I think the conditions today are quite a bit different, but we haven't solved the problems, and I don't know enough to really comment on universal basic income, but my gut kind of tells me that's not the right way to go either. That just paying everyone off because we've obviated them isn't the right way to deal with the meaningfulness that people place in their endeavors.
Yeah, and that might suggest a level of sophistication in our governance that may or may not be present.
One of the key things that we teach, one of the things that's core, I'd say, to the mission of the School of Design is the notion of human-centeredness. You design by understanding people and the frameworks in which they live and exist and spend their time, and then you try to understand them and design for them. So this is a kind of design that I've been practicing for 25 years, and I think that central to that is a notion of dignity. You need to keep human dignity in mind if you are designing for humans. When I'm teaching, I'm trying to get students to be aware of the effects of what they design and how they design. And I'm kind of not answering your question, but I'm answering your question. One thing I do, for instance, the class that I'm teaching right now is called Seminar 1. And it's the first year seminar. It starts the very first slot, the very first day of school for our Master of Design and first and second year students, or 1 and 2 year students, excuse me. And inevitably I get the question when we go through the syllabus, what does this have to do with interaction design? You know, we do some stuff up front about, here are some key terms in interaction design. Here's where the field of interaction design came from in the 90s. Here's the school's role in that field. And a lot of the class is looking at questions of bias and privacy and AI and Silicon Valley culture. And so when I had to answer this question last week for one of my students, I said, you know, the majority of you are going to graduate from here and go work at companies like Google or Microsoft or Facebook, or you're going to go work at design firms, design studios who address, that are addressing different kinds of technological implementations, right? You're going to be designing for mobile, designing for web, designing systems of all kinds. And you absolutely need to know where you're going to be working and the context in which you're working in order to do this work correctly. And you have a studio class, your interaction design studio, you're going to be working on the craft of digital design, and in your communication design class, you're going to be working on your skills in graphic and color and other modes of communication. In this class, you're going to make sense of where you're working. And typically it has an impact on students where at the end of it they say, well, gee, I came here thinking I was going to do one kind of work and now I'm not totally sure what I should be doing. And I don't want to cause a crisis of conscience for anyone, but I do want people to be critical. And I have to say that previous before my career in academia, I worked in Silicon Valley for 12 years, and in the tech industry for 12 years. So if I weren't doing what I was doing for a living, I might be working in Silicon Valley, at Microsoft, at Facebook, at Google, right? It is entirely possible or likely that would be my path. The point being that it's important to have a context in which you're looking at the impact of technology on labor, on users, on humans, on systems, on what you're modeling, and at least have some knowledge of what you're going into so you can think accordingly and raise the right questions in the right contexts. All of them? I'm looking up there for my row of Foucault.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, the all Foucault all the time.
The anxieties that you've been articulating.
Yeah. Boy, I see that on so many levels. Again, from an educational standpoint, I want people to be aware of the rhetoric, of the goals, so that they understand the power differential. In a classroom, I also want to be empowering people to be better design leaders. These are future design leaders that I have, not just workers. These are the people who are going to be running teams in just a couple of years, and entire enterprises not long after that, and if they do things right. It turns out that all of my students this semester in my seminar are female. So that's an interesting question of power and power differential. And I have a very, very deep interest in how women have, how we develop the leadership capability of women, especially at a university with so heavy a technological focus that has had issues on in sexism in the past, and probably present. So I am very committed to finding ways to speak truth to power in certain ways and enable other people to do so. And I think that part of that is in highlighting what people cede to systems, right? This semester, I'm pleased that I get to invite Lori Craner to my class. It's the first time that I will have invited her, but I'm looking forward to bringing those questions of privacy and privacy trade-offs to a group of designers to suss out. There's always the, if you don't have anything to hide, you have nothing to fear statement, which we all know isn't quite right, but it's an important one to ask in classrooms, and it's an important one to ask in the public. It's the flip side of a lot of systems we use. I think that Facebook has the ability to empower individuals or groups. A personal thing that I keep using it for, I am a Facebook user and I'm someone who's got 4,600 friends on Facebook, is the fact that people meet in conversations on my page that could never have met anywhere in real life. Colleagues meeting my cousins, meeting friends in foreign countries, meeting people I knew in high school, yeah. If the filter bubble doesn't shut things down too much, people who think quite a bit differently than me, not surprisingly, my suburban high school has any number of people whose politics are quite different than my own. And sometimes there can open up an opportunity to have a conversation that wouldn't have happened before. The problem about algorithms is that they tend to reinforce what they know and what we already know, and so we get the filter bubble problem where we shut down views that are different and instead reinforce the ones that are more similar. So I guess in that sense, I still maintain some of the early optimism that I had way back at the beginning of my career in the early 90s when I started using BBSs, and in the early web when I was working with people like Howard Rheingold on online community, or working at Netscape at on online community and, tools for web building. My hope at that point was that maybe these tools would open people up to lots of things. And instead, I now look at it all in horror and say, oh, crap, that didn't go the way we thought it was going to go. These tools can also be used for harm, great harm. Facebook. I mean, again, it's
the richness of the example continues to.
No, but I mean, really, it is really multi-edged, or maybe it's Janus faced. I don't know, but it's multiple sides. Do we see the extents, or are we just in a big ocean and we don't see? It's the experience of bobbing in the ocean, and the shore being too far to see if you've ever jumped off the boat in the middle of an ocean. And you know the boat's around, I was going to say around the corner, but it's an ocean, there are no corners. The boat's near, but you can't yet see it. And I think I'm losing my thread here. But yeah, you don't see the edges of it, you don't see the boundaries, you don't see what you don't see. It's interesting to have come of age in this time period. I'm in my mid-late 40s, and I'm someone who airmailed letters back from my exchange year in Germany 30 years ago, and had exorbitant telephone bills because I fell in love with someone who lived in a different country in the early 90s, and then had the beginning of email for me on a college campus, or the beginning of the World Wide Web for me in 1994 in that career. And it's an interesting place to have seen so much of this change. I think I still remember what it used to be before this all happened. And and yet it's not like we're going back.
The ways in which we begin to work within your metaphor of basically being at sea, right? And use language that we don't see what we don't see. And I think about the ways in which that is in this tension with the seeming arrogance of a data-infused world that suggests it can be known, right? Or that if enough information is digitized and networked, it will be holistic in some way, that we won't fall into that notion.
I think a couple things. Okay, first of all, the notion of holism has been central to notions of artificial intelligence, because if you look at the history of cognitive psychology, that notion goes back to Kafka in 1922. The whole is different than the sum of its parts is what he wrote. Not the same, or not, what is it? The whole is different. Yeah, the whole is different than the sum of its parts, or is more than the sum of... Shoot, I should remember this better than this. Arr! But anyway, I think that the idea that the aggregate is different than the notion of a whole is worth considering. And these questions of parts to wholes are vital to big questions of system design, of modeling, and of how we model any kind of intelligence. The other thing we know about the history of cognitive psychology is that as we're better able to model something, the brain, intelligence, we'll come up with a new paradigm. I mean, Alan Newell and Herb Simon believed that around 1959 or so, they were going to have this issue of modeling the human brain licked. Like, they've got it. They had it done. Newell, Simon, and Shaw wrote that they were going to have that done in 1959 with their general problem solver. And it turned out that it's a little bit more complicated than that. But it also turns out that every time we think that just enough data would begin to tell us we're going to have another quantum leap, quantum computing, bigger understanding of what the brain is and does, bigger understanding of what neuroscience does, it will get more and more sophisticated. it will feed back into what kind of data we believe we need to do this right. Or we'll discover we were completely wrong to begin with, and that's not actually how it works. What I think it says more about is who we are as people, that we continually try to do this kind of modeling. And that's something that extends back throughout history and will continue forward. We will keep coming up with new ways to model, and new ways to find data, and new ways to define what that data is and how we should parse it, and what it is to parse it and what substrates it's stored on. But maybe it's an always, almost, already, not quite. Again, drawing this time from kind of cultural history of the early 20th century and history of art, and a couple of threads around uncanniness and what we might learn, where humans and machines might learn from each other. The world was going to hell in World War I. Warfare unlike any kind of warfare that the world had seen. It was impossible to fathom. The world was increasingly electrified, technological, mechanical. Please hold on. So the world was increasingly mechanical and electrified. And so what was necessary to do was to rethink the role of art. And so that's where Dadaism comes from. When the world is going to hell, what is art? Who knows? And so I think that this is important to think about today when we look at the funny things or uncanny things that AI can do. I'm a huge, huge fan of Janelle Shane's work and her website, AIweirdness.com. She trains neural nets to do ridiculous things. But the reason behind it is because by doing so, she can show what the edges of the algorithms are. We learn what they do and we learn what they don't. And there is something really interesting about machines and autonomy in humans there. Masahiro Mori wrote about the uncanny valley in 1970 in an issue of Energy magazine in Japan. And uncanniness is what we experience when we get to machines that are too like us, right? And he talked about understanding the uncanny valley as an understanding of what makes us human, not what makes machines machines, what makes us human. And I'm so deeply interested in that idea about machines and machine autonomy and where machines and humans cross over, helping us to question what those boundaries are, because we've been doing it and there's all the more reason to be doing it today. I think that you can consider the history of absurdism in theater, for instance, people like Eugene Ionesco, and the role that his plays played in questioning authoritarianism and totalitarianism. We have some pretty scary political situations happening with the rise of populism, nationalism, and the U.S. government, Donald Trumpism. And I think that there's something that uncanniness can actually provide that is provocative and important, that maybe we can work together with machines to see new ways of seeing and being and questioning. So I want to see some of those possibilities. I'm not a big fan of the notion of superintelligence, and I get annoyed at Nick Bostrom. Again, it's an idea that ultra-intelligence is something that has been written about since 1964 in the work of I.J. Good. But I do think that part of our role in speaking to a public and educating our students and doing deep academic research and holding tight to our notions of ethics and causing other people to question their own notions of ethics where technological facts meet are a way to look at these important issues and to understand the value of the human and the value of the machine.